This presentation is based on my work published on arXiv under this ID number shown here. It's about particle physics applications, but I will make this talk a little broader than that. So the fundamental question at hand is, how does one marry machine learning methods to applied physics? Understandably, physicists hesitate to use machine learning models in fundamental problems because such models are black boxes with many uninterpretable parameters, whereas physics usually requires simple models that are highly constrained. The foremost source of such constraints in physics are symmetries. So we believe that building physics-informed machine learning methods that employ group theory to enforce symmetries is the best way to increase the adoption of machine learning in fundamental physics research. Of course, this idea is not really new. In fact, many of the already existing methods, even things like graph networks and recurrent networks, can be understood as certain symmetry-enforcing types of networks. In convolutional neural networks used in image recognition, the ability to recognize objects equally well regardless of the location of the object in the image is achieved by using convolutions, which are explicitly translation equivariant operations. But what about more general symmetries like rotations? So one natural approach that was proposed by Cohen and Welling was to use convolutions on general Lie groups. In fact, this works on arbitrary Lie groups, but depending on the nature of the input data, other approaches might be more natural. There are many benefits to enforcing symmetries in neural networks, all reflected in the example of CNNs. Aside from reducing the number of necessary parameters, improving interpretability, and solving some data sampling issues, we get significantly more transparent physical models where the intermediate mathematical operations make geometrical and physical sense, and the parameters can also have a clear physical meaning just by virtue of respecting the symmetries. The basic property that needs to be enforced to provide a covariant machine learning method is that of group equivariance. This means that the inputs are expected to be vectors that transform linearly under the action of the symmetry group, and acting on the inputs with a chosen group element called G in this picture, and then evaluating the outputs shown by this animation should produce an output that is linearly transformed via the same exact group element G. In other words, the action of the group, in a sense, commutes with the evaluation of the network. And our work is part of a bigger program that's been going on for the last few years, building connections between machine learning and symmetries. But we believe that our work in these two highlighted papers at the end is the first direct implementation and application of such ideas in physics problems. So how do we actually implement these sorts of constraints? Let's think of a simple feed-forward neural network. It can be visualized as a sequence of maps between a sequence of vector spaces, with the maps alternating between linear learnable maps and fixed nonlinear maps. To make the entire network equivariant, we must naturally require that all of these maps be equivariant. For the linear map, this requirement greatly restricts it in terms of the number of free parameters in it, and for the nonlinear map acting on the vector inputs, we find that the symmetry requirement essentially restricts such maps to be just tensor products of vectors, and that's an incredibly powerful constraint. Implementing these maps requires knowledge of the representation theory of the relevant symmetry group, and in particular its Clebsch-Gordon decompositions, which are painfully familiar to every physicist. And we've done exactly that for two applications. In the first one, on which I did not work, 3D rotation equivariant networks were used to predict certain chemical quantities for sets of molecules in a way that is exactly invariant under rotations of these molecules in 3D space. And that gave us great predictions with fewer parameters than the competing methods. In the second problem, I developed the representation theory and the code implementation of the equivariant neural network, and we used this Lorentz group invariant network to classify so-called jets of particles produced in simulated proton-proton collisions based on whether the initial decay contained the massive top quark or other lighter quarks. It's a binary classification task, and we got competitive performance while using orders of magnitude fewer parameters, which is, of course, the most obvious direct benefit of implementing symmetries in neural networks.